Same-sex marriage. Hey, we've often talked about it here on Legal Video Blog, and we've often talked about it because it frequently is making legal news these days. And why? Because the rights of a same-sex couple are being worked out. We don't fully know what they are. A lot of states don't recognize same-sex marriage. Those that do, well, what happens to somebody who's married in one state and then they move someplace where the marriage isn't recognized? Causes lots of issues, and it takes us to this week's case. It involves a case in Cincinnati, Ohio. Case was filed there by 4 people who were involved in same-sex marriages. 2 guys who were involved in same-sex marriage, 2 women who were involved in a same-sex marriage. They both were married in a state that allowed same-sex marriages. Both couples moved to Ohio and adopted a child. They wanted to have the birth certificate for the child read that the parents were the parents who had been engaged in this marriage, which would mean the birth certificate would have 2 people of the same sex, either 2 men or 2 women. Well, the state of Ohio said, hey, no way, we cannot file that birth certificate because here in Ohio, marriage is defined as a union between a man and a woman. Therefore, you guys don't have a valid marriage in the state of Ohio and we can't file this birth certificate. Both couples said, no, we don't buy this, and they brought suit in a federal district court in Cincinnati, Ohio. And there they argued on behalf of themselves, through their attorneys, that Ohio had an obligation under the U.S. Constitution, full faith and credit portion of the U.S. Constitution, to recognize the marriage that took place in another state. On the other side, the folks representing the state of Ohio argued on behalf of the state, no we don't. Traditionally, marriage is defined in the United States by each individual state, and each individual state gets to decide what a marriage is and what it's going to recognize as a marriage. Here in Ohio, we do not recognize same-sex marriages, and we're not going to issue this birth certificate. Well, those were the 2 arguments. The case went forward, and last week the judge who was hearing this case made a preliminary decision, which is now going to be published in the next week, in which he has indicated that he is going to find that Ohio must issue birth certificates with the names of the 2 parents, the 2 same-sex parents, the 2 fathers, the 2 mothers, and that Ohio must issue that under the full faith and credit clause of the U.S. Constitution, which, by the way, basically provides that if a legal act occurs and is recognized in one state, such as New York, let's say New York, somebody enters into a contract, and New York has some very specific or unusual requirements for entering into a contract. If it's validly done in New York and the people move to Illinois to enforce the contract, well, Illinois needs to recognize that contract. They might have to make some accommodation if the contract requires certain requirements that are only recognized by New York. But anyway, long story short, full faith and credit, you need to recognize the acts of another state. So this is the preliminary decision of the judge. We expect it to become the actual decision. What it means is that Ohio must recognize the marriage with respect to issuing a birth certificate. It does not mean, under the very narrow nature of this case, that Ohio must allow same-sex marriages. It just simply says if you get married someplace outside of Ohio where same-sex marriages are allowed, you come to Ohio, Ohio needs to recognize it, at least with respect to issuing a birth certificate. Okay, so what is the point that we learn from this case? Well, we learn is that the whole issue of the rights of same-sex couples is being worked out right now. We're really in much of the same kind of situation that existed in the 1920s, 1930s, even into the 1940s and 50s in the United States with regard to divorce. Remember, in the old movies, you see people talking about going to Reno to get a divorce. They had to live in Reno for 6 weeks, and then they were granted jurisdiction by the state of Nevada, and they would get a divorce. Well, that divorce wasn't always recognized in all states, and there was a lot of litigation that took place until finally those divorces were recognized. And we are now in a set of circumstances in this country in which same-sex marriage is going through the same kind of maturation. And we're going to find out what those rights are and what they may not be. So guess what? You need to stay tuned so you can find out what the law provides. I'm David Allen.